Key principles of child development. Child development is a theoretical framework. It's a design that helps us better able to discuss, understand, and apply our knowledge of how children develop, grow, and change over time. It is a series of domains that allow us to understand the aspects of development that are unique: cognitive and mental development, language development, social, emotional, physical, motor development. All of those things are how we understand pieces of the child's development, but they all must come together as a whole to help us understand the whole child. Before we really dig into those specific domains and break those down, it's important we start with the foundation of what underpins that development. The first principle is related to the idea of developmental milestones. And if you have children in your life through family or your own children, or you work with children, you understand how we are drawn to look for and watch for milestones. Developmental milestones are those indicators, those markers of growth and change in an emerging sort of way through those areas of development. Parents will often use those milestones as evidence that their child is growing in the ways that they've expected. Thinking about children yourself, what might be some of those milestones that you can think of that we would look for with small children? Looking at milestones in motor development, we eventually will start watching for children as they develop to be able to sit up without props or supports like pillows. Eventually, they'll start pulling to stand and crawling, walking, eventually skipping and hopping. When we look at fine motor with small children, when we hand them a rattle with infants, they'll grasp that rattle with their whole hand. Eventually, we start seeing more manipulation of their fingers, and we can see them use their pincer grasp to pick up things like Cheerios on their high chair. So, when we're looking at language milestones, we see evidence of cooing and then babbling, moving into one word words to short two to three word statements, and then more onto conversations. Those are what we mean by developmental milestones. The second principle we'll look at is the idea of sequences of development. As you watch children play and grow, you notice that there are predictable steps along developmental domains that you can see them evolve from one of those milestones to the next. That's the idea of sequencing. Those milestones do have a predetermined order for the most part. And that's the critical aspect of sequencing, the order of the skills. It's not particularly helpful to focus on just their age in months and years because, as we know, children follow through on these sequences in different rates and in different ways. Child development also does not unfold in a straightforward and smooth manner. Child development moves forward in growth spurts and in regression. So sometimes, while one area of development is seeing great growth, another more recent skill may show signs of going backwards temporarily. So, where a child who was fully capable to identify their body signals that they needed to go to the washroom and be able to care for that need may show signs of regression where maybe they have accidents while they're building a new skill in the short term because that toilet learning is so fresh in their skill set. The third principle we're looking at here is the idea of age level expectancies or norms. When children are taken to the doctor, they're measured by weight and height. And those outcomes, those numbers, are measured against the growth charts to say, are they at the norm of most children in their given culture? Are they above the norm or below the norm? This information can be helpful if we understand how to apply it. This is age related in the sense that it's looking at how children move through their sequences and through their milestones not at their exact age point, but at a range. It's often, norms are often misused where they're looking at what a 2 year old should be able to do. When you're looking at development, it could be this skill is typically developed at the norm for children between 22 and 26 months. That gives a range. So we don't tend to compare one child with the other because that is very misleading. Two-year olds have very different ranges and levels and skill sets. So it's important when we think about norms that we look at the sequence and the range of development. The fourth principle we'll look at is the idea of organization and reorganization. When we move into mental cognitive development, we'll look at Jean Piaget's idea of organization. This is essentially the idea that children move through a series of phases as they develop. And as we've probably all seen in children in our own lives, they have spurts of growth where one area of development may seem to suddenly leap ahead. Following those periods of rapid growth, there's a period of disorganization where the brain needs to reorganize what they've learned. During those periods, a child's body is very busy. Both their brain and their body is trying to incorporate new information. And those are the periods of time when you may witness that regression that I spoke about. Also, it's not unusual to see a child who typically would be quite cooperative sometimes have behavioral issues while they're trying to incorporate and integrate that new information. These regressions and behavioral issues are often short-lived, but understanding organization and reorganization gives educators a huge boost in patience when you can understand there is a physical root or a developmental root sometimes for this regression and this behavior that you're witnessing. It's essential that during these times, children experience patience and an educator or adult who demonstrates an understanding for support as opposed to punishment in these periods of time. The fifth principle that we'll look at is the idea of the interrelatedness of developmental domain. We break down development into the areas of development so that we can understand the sequence of language. We can understand the sequence of motor development and the sequences and norms and milestones of all of these areas. An educator understands that no one developmental area evolves on its own. For a child to learn to speak and use language, they need the muscle tone and the strength of muscles and parts of their mouth and their tongue and their lips to be able to produce sounds. In order to develop social skills and self-regulation, children need to understand that the cognitive developmental aspect, the cognitive skill that others are separate from me. So these are all examples of how domains do not develop in and of themselves. They don't develop in a vacuum. Each one interplays with the other, and as one jumps ahead, the other may slow down for a little bit because there's so much brain activity happening in that one area. And as children get older, they can tend to have more of a mix of developments happening without those obvious growth spurts, but then you may see a child shoot up in 2 or 3 inches in a week or so, and that seems like it's just physical growth, but think about the work your body has had to do to make that happen. The sixth principle we'll look at is the idea of individual differences. We know that children's biology is unique. Their genetic code is all theirs, only theirs. But there are other factors that contribute to a child's unique difference from every other person. These factors are influenced by environment, but they're very much a part of who that child is, who that person is from the very beginning. A big one is temperament. And temperament is really fascinating. If you think about 3 different children, you can think of a child who is feisty and everything, they're either extremely excited or they're extremely worked up, and everything is at that high feisty level. They engage their environment. They bring themselves to the environment and they force the environment to respond. Another temperament may be a child who's much more laid back and doesn't necessarily draw the world to them, but are totally comfortable to be in the world as they are. A third temperament may be a child who is very watchful and cautious and don't necessarily engage their environment immediately, but they want to assess what's happening around them. Those are all examples of unique temperaments that children will have and how it impacts their experience and interactions in the world. Another element that makes each person unique is the set of behaviors and attitudes that we bring to our interactions. Those behaviors are interpreted externally as being directly or indirectly attributed to male or female gender, but they are inherently the unique person who we each are. And the third individual difference we'll look at here is the idea of ecology. In some of your courses, you'll learn about the Bronfenbrenner ecological model, which is essentially looking at from the child's living room to their classroom to their playgrounds to the larger influences such as government policies, housing issues. All of those things impact how a child experiences their world. And everyone's ecology is unique and different from another person's ecology. Even two twin siblings have different friends and different interactions and different influences. The seventh principle is the idea of transactional patterns of behavior. And a lot of what we've already talked about relates to this idea where a child is not developing outside of their ecology. They interact with their world, they bring their temperament to the world, they interact with different people who respond in specific ways. And that transaction between the child and the people and environments around them promotes and influences development in a wide range of ways. This is where the work of a professional educator is critical to understand the transactions of responsiveness, of consistent and patient responses to behavioral issues, and to understand that each one of us learns who we are based on how the world interacts with us. So that transaction, when that child presents you with that feisty temperament, or they come to you with an ecology that is outside your comfort zone or your belief system, research shows that when the adults in a child's life understand the importance of healthy relationships and the impact that those relations have on development, children develop better self-concept, better language, cognitive, all of those areas of development flourish based on the ways that adults interact with them. And the eighth and final principle we'll look at today is to consider the idea of typical versus atypical development. What does it mean to compare typical versus atypical? In terms of child development, typical development implies that the child's growing, changing, and acquiring those broad range of skills that we'll talk about in the same sequence and norms that most children in their similar age range will develop. Looking at the idea of atypical development, it's anything that would be considered a significant difference or deviation or marked delay from what we know to be those common milestone sequences and norms. It's important to note here that any child who experiences a deviation or delay in development is still first and foremost a child, as every child has the same basic rights and needs. The reason we talk about typical versus atypical is never to isolate or to separate children from one from the other. The idea is to understand typical development so when we acknowledge there is something that needs a different kind of support, we can respond to that. And that is exactly what we do with development. We use it to understand how to respond, how to support, how to guide children through their experiences, through their days and lives with us. So those are the 8 principles to give us an understanding of how to think about development as we dig in here this coming week. Keep these principles in mind as you work through your other courses. You'll see a lot of connections and associations related to play, related to communications, related to your own understanding of yourself as an educator as you move through the foundations course. So there is a lot of ways that these principles come into your world as a professional educator. So now I encourage you to go back over the eight. The document is in the course shell as well that outlines these eight in a two-page Word doc. Go back and look through them. Think about each of them for a few minutes and bring those children in your life into your mind. Where do you see their milestones, their sequences, and their norms? What are some things you're noticing about the children you've observed in your life? And when you're thinking about transactional interaction in terms of relationships, those individual differences, bring those all back into your mind and try to associate what you're learning with what you already know.